You smell it before you see it, the sickly perfume of decay masked with incense. The air is thick, the candles tremble, and somewhere beneath the velvet canopy of a dying empire, you feel the pulse of a nation that no longer breathes. You're not in a palace, you're inside a tomb, still pretending to rule. Before we descend into this haunting chapter of Spain's history, take a moment. If you're watching from Madrid, Manila, or Mexico City, let me know where your story meets this one. Isn't it strange, this communion of strangers bound by the ghosts of kings? Like and subscribe if you believe history isn't dead, it merely waits for us to open the coffin. The corpse on the throne was still warm when the courtiers began to whisper. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, El Decido, the desired one, had desired too much. His body, swollen and pale, lay beneath gold-threaded sheets, while the bells of Madrid told a hollow lament. Outside, rain slicked the cobblestones of the Calle de Alcalá, and the people watched the palace windows for signs of change, though few still believed in it. The savior they had once cheered in the streets had become a specter of their own making. How had it come to this? How had the nation that bled to cast off Napoleon's chains ended up enslaved again, this time by its own king? The answer began years before the corpse cooled, in the smoke of war and the fever of false hope. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the streets erupted. They threw flowers, shouted "Viva el Decido," and tore down the French tricolor with trembling hands. Yet beneath their cheers ran a tremor of desperation. After years of foreign occupation, famine, and humiliation, Spain would have embraced any man who promised to restore its soul. Ferdinand smiled, kissed children, raised his hand like a benediction, and within months, abolished the liberal constitution that had made him possible. In the Escorial, his laughter echoed through endless corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who had once commanded half the world. Spain does not need thinkers, he told his ministers, it needs obedience. They nodded, and the prisons filled. The ink of scholars dried into blood. There are records burned, then rewritten, of midnight arrests, of women dragged from their homes for whispers against the crown. In the cellars of Madrid's prisons, the smell of mold and fear clung to the walls like old prayers. A soldier once wrote, "We thought we were guarding a king. Instead, we guarded his madness." Yet Ferdinand's cruelty was not loud. It was methodical, bureaucratic, dressed in parchment and seal. He preferred to let others dirty their hands. Priests who denounced, generals who hanged, censors who blacked out the soul of a nation word by word. Still, he would stroll the gardens of Aranjuez, stroking the petals of white roses, murmuring to his favorites about loyalty and sin as though he were God himself. One evening, when his young queen Maria Josepha wept after another failed pregnancy, he told her, "God takes what he cannot trust me to raise." His voice was flat, his eyes wet only from wine. In that moment, she saw not a husband but a man enthralled by his own curse, to rule by fear because he could rule by nothing else. Spain, too, began to mirror its master. Churches overflowed while bread ran scarce. The nobility feasted under chandeliers that dripped wax like tears. Soldiers, unpaid, sold their rifles for food, while the secret police grew fat on bribes. The Inquisition had been abolished, but its shadow lingered in every parish confessional. What was heresy now? To think, to write, to remember that liberty had once been more than a dream. By 1820, a spark of rebellion flickered among the army. Liberal officers mutinied, demanding the return of the Constitution. Ferdinand, cornered and terrified, signed it under duress. "They can chain my hands," he muttered to his confessor, "but not my will." He was right. 3 years later, the French army, the 100,000 sons of St. Louis, marched across the Pyrenees to restore divine order. Spain was conquered again, this time in God's name. Ferdinand greeted them as saviors, smiling through rotting teeth. He aged quickly after that. Gout turned his legs to swollen pillars. His face sagged beneath powder and pain. The courtiers whispered that his temper worsened, that he struck servants and cursed portraits when no one watched. In the end, even the priests avoided his chambers after dark. The king slept surrounded by candles, fearing that the darkness would speak his name, and when at last he did alone, choking on his own breath, the silence that followed was not mourning. It was relief. Outside, the people crossed themselves, not out of reverence but superstition, as if the ghost of tyranny might still linger in the air. But death did not free Spain, it merely changed the mask. In the corridors of the palace, servants moved the corpse from room to room, while the courtiers argued over succession. The wax on the king's face cracked beneath the heat. Someone whispered, "He still looks alive." Perhaps he was, because even as his body cooled, the machinery of repression kept turning the prisons, the spies, the silence. The throne was empty, yet power still breathed through the marble halls like a foul wind, refusing to die. And somewhere, beyond the palace gates, a young princess named Isabel stirred in her cradle, unaware that her father's sins would soon become her inheritance. The candles flickered again. The corpse smiled. Spain was not done rotting. The corridors of the Palacio Real glowed with a beauty so precise it seemed unnatural mirrors, catching chandeliers, silk curtains breathing in the stale air of power. Yet every step that echoed there belonged not to queens or heirs, but to women pacing inside invisible cages. Ferdinand VII ruled Spain, as he ruled his household, with suspicion, possessiveness, and an appetite that fed on fear. It began, as it always did, with him, in performance. The king liked ceremony, even in cruelty. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, came to him bright-eyed and foreign, her laughter too free for the Spanish court's stone gravity. A Neapolitan bird, one nobleman whispered, singing in a cage of iron. She tried to please him, to turn affection into armor. But Ferdinand's affection was a blade. He loved to watch her flinch. When illness struck her after only a few years, rumors spread like rot through the corridors. Poison, witchcraft, punishment. No one ever proved it. Her body left Madrid in silence, and Ferdinand watched from the window, his face unreadable, the lace of his sleeve fluttering in the cold wind. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Braganza, promised renewal. She was young, pious, and enamored of the arts. She dreamed of restoring Spain's spirit, founding museums, breathing life into a suffocating court. For a while, hope flickered, but even she could not outshine the gloom that stalked the royal chambers. Ferdinand demanded obedience as proof of devotion. He called it love. She called it faith. Neither survived. Maria Isabel died giving birth to a stillborn child, and the court draped its walls in black. Ferdinand ordered that her rooms remain untouched, as though she might walk back through them at any moment. Yet each night he passed the door, pausing, listening, and muttering, "They all leave." The palace became a mausoleum of women. Portraits hung like ghosts, delicate faces, glass eyes, frozen smiles. Ferdinand's third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was barely 17, a child cloaked in duty. Her innocence disgusted him as much as it tempted him. The priests whispered to her about submission, about the sacred obedience owed to a husband and king. Ferdinand turned faith into a ritual of degradation. He forced her to pray beside his bed before their wedding night, her trembling voice reciting psalms while his hands rested on the Bible and then on her. By morning, the prayers had soured into silence. Within 3 years, she too was dead. Each death deepened his obsession with control. He began to keep ledgers, not of finances or decrees, but of behavior. Servants, ladies in waiting, even his surviving relatives were listed with remarks in his own spidery hand. Too cheerful, talks when not spoken to, defiant. It was said he could recall the tone of a servant's laugh years after dismissal, and would mutter their names in the dark. When he married for the 4th time Maria Cristina of Naples, he was already a ruin of a man. Gout swelled his limbs, his eyes gleamed with feverish suspicion, and the palace physicians had begun to speak in euphemisms, melancholic delusions, holy mania. But Maria Cristina was not like the others. She had a spine of quiet steel, the patience of survival. She smiled when he raged, soothed him when he trembled, and learned quickly that in the House of Bourbon, love was the art of not dying. It was during these years that Ferdinand's daughters became ornaments of his decay. They were rarely seen in public, their education reduced to hymns, embroidery, and lessons in silence. When the youngest, Isabel, once laughed too loudly in the corridor, Ferdinand struck the marble with his cane and barked, "A princess is seen, not heard." The echo of that blow followed her all her life. Behind the gilded doors, the rituals grew stranger. The king demanded evening processions through the halls, wives' daughters, and maids parading before him in order of rank. He would inspect their posture, their attire, even the way their eyes met his. Those who failed to please were dismissed without word, sent to convents or distant estates. The courtiers called it the procession of dolls. The women called it what it was, judgment. Visitors from foreign courts noted the chill that hung over Madrid. Ambassadors described a royal household gripped by superstition and fear. "He keeps his women as he keeps his kingdom," one wrote to Paris, "locked, watched, and broken." And still, Ferdinand prayed nightly, demanding absolution from the same God whose commandments he violated with every breath. As his health failed, the palace descended into paranoia. Maria Cristina maneuvered carefully, aware that her own survival and that of her infant daughter, Isabel, depended on the king's crumbling will. He grew erratic, signing decrees in the dead of night, then burning them by dawn. Sometimes he would call for his late wives, asking servants to prepare their rooms, insisting he had heard their footsteps in the corridor. "They come to remind me," he once muttered to a terrified guard, "that Spain has no sons, only widows." In those final months, the palace was a theater of ghosts. Curtains stirred without wind. Bells rang with no hand to pull them. Maria Cristina began sleeping with a crucifix clutched to her chest. She knew what the courtiers whispered, that her husband was possessed, or cursed, or simply consumed by the power he could no longer wield. When Ferdinand finally collapsed in 1833, the queen wept not from grief but from the weight of release. His daughters were led into a chamber lit by a single candle. The youngest stared at her father's lifeless form, then at her mother's trembling hands. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not reverence, it was inheritance. Outside, the bells of Madrid tolled again. The sound rolled through the palace, over portraits, over empty cradles, over rooms that smelled of perfume and rot. In the House of Broken Daughters, the echoes never stopped. Madrid, 1829. The city did not speak, it listened. Cobbled streets carried whispers like contraband, and the air itself seemed to bow before the palace. Spain had become a land where silence was safer than breath. Every tavern, every chapel, every shadowed alley housed ears that reported to the throne. Words were no longer tools of thought, they were traps. Ferdinand VII's Spain was a kingdom embalmed in fear. The printing presses that once thundered with revolution now slept under lock and key. Every letter was opened before delivery, every newspaper censored into obedience. The people no longer debated, they nodded. Even the church bells seemed to toll more softly, as though mindful that too much sound might be considered rebellion. In the royal council, the king sat beneath a portrait of himself painted younger, broader. Godlike hand watched his ministers tremble. The disease of liberty, he croaked, voice thick from years of gout and rage, must be burned out, root and branch. They murmured assent, and the machinery of repression ground on. The secret police, de voluntarios realistas, scoured Spain like hounds, sniffing for Men vanished in daylight, women disappeared at confession. A careless toast, a forgotten phrase, even a sigh could summon the dungeon. In Cadiz, a poet named Torrijos was executed at dawn, his final verse, swallowed by the sea breeze. In Zaragoza, the walls of the citadel sweated with the blood of officers who had once dared to dream of liberty. The prisons overflowed, so the gallows multiplied. The people stopped looking one another in the eye. What, after all, was more dangerous than recognition? And yet, amid the silence, Ferdinand's paranoia grew louder. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, imagined betrayal in the faces of his own guards. He forbade gatherings of more than 3 men in the streets, terrified that conversation itself might become a revolution. He demanded loyalty oaths from his generals, priests, even his cooks. The act of eating in his presence became a ritual of suspicion. Every dish tasted first by trembling servants. At night, the palace echoed with his coughing, his prayers, his curses. He would rise from his bed, swollen legs dragging across the marble, and pace the corridors like a ghost in search of another ghost. They whisper, he muttered once to his confessor, even when they are silent. His queen, Maria Cristina, endured his decay with the composure of a widow before the body was cold. She had learned to speak in half-truths and careful silences, to soothe the king's fits with devotion that masked disgust. When he raged about imagined plots, she nodded. When he wept over the loyalty of a god he no longer trusted, she crossed herself and looked away. Her only real allegiance was to her daughters, especially the young Isabel, the fragile heir to a dying dynasty. Spain, too, was fracturing. The liberals had been crushed, but their ideas survived underground, carried by students, soldiers, and exiles who smuggled pamphlets across borders like relics of forbidden faith. Across the Pyrenees, in Paris and London, Spanish exiles plotted the future while their homeland suffocated. Ferdinand's regime had silenced their tongues, but not their memories. Inside the palace, decay became spectacle. Visitors described the king's swollen body, his face waxy with illness, his breath sour with rot. His hand shook as he signed decrees condemning men to death. The royal physicians called it hydropsy. The people called it divine punishment. But still, he ruled. Still, the decrees came. The ink of tyranny had not yet dried. By 1832, Ferdinand could scarcely walk. He was carried from room to room, his attendants lifting his gout-swollen feet onto velvet cushions. Yet even as his body betrayed him, his need for control deepened. He ordered spies to follow his own queen, convinced she conspired against him. He replaced ministers weekly, claiming they plotted with demons. "I will not die," he said once, clutching a crucifix so tightly it drew blood. "Spain cannot live without me." That autumn, as fever gripped him, a different battle began, the war for succession. Maria Cristina, desperate to protect her daughter's future, convinced him to sign the Pragmatic Ascension, allowing Isabel to inherit the throne despite the old Salic law forbidding female succession. The absolutists, led by his brother Don Carlos, saw it as treason. The court split overnight. Cristinos for the queen, Carlistas for the brother. The sound of marching boots began to echo again in the provinces. Spain was preparing for another war even before the corpse was cold. The king lingered through winter, swollen, raving, a monarch unmade by his own terror. He screamed for the priests, for forgiveness, for silence. Maria Cristina stood at the door, watching the man who had devoured her life now choke on his own paranoia. "You will keep them loyal," he rasped to her. "You will keep them afraid." She bowed her head, and he smiled, a grimace carved from madness. When Ferdinand finally died in September 1833, Madrid did not weep, it exhaled. But the silence that followed was not peace, it was the pause before thunder. The kingdom he left behind was a house of echoes, each one calling another to arms. His brother raised the banner of rebellion. His daughter, barely 3 years old, became a symbol of fragile continuity. In Spain, weary of silence, began to shout once more. In the palace, servants prepared the funeral chamber. The curtains were drawn, the candles lit, the air thick with incense and dread. A courtier looked upon the dead king's face and whispered, "He never believed in ghosts." But the other man beside him crossed himself and murmured, "That's because he became one." The bells began to toll again, slow, measured, endless. Across Spain, the silence cracked, and from its depths, the sound of war began to rise.